Hi there, my name is Sam for the CG9 project, and today we're going to be taking a skeptical look at, well, skeptics. Yeah, you know, those people who claim to be the defenders of critical thinking and science, I guess. I wish. In particular, we're going to be taking a look at a video by skeptical YouTuber Rebecca Watson called The Lack of Scientific Evidence for Life After Death. We're going to analyze some of the claims made by Rebecca throughout the video, and I am going to give my point of view of why I think that some of the claims that she makes are wrong or are misleading. And unlike Rebecca, we are actually going to be citing some sources for the things that we're going to say on this video. How exciting! And without further ado, we are now switching to the video. Enjoy!
Hey, have you ever almost died? Have you ever almost died so hard that you floated above your body, you saw a tunnel with a light at the end, and then you went to heaven for a minute and Jesus looked at you and gave you a high five and said, you know what, keep up the good work, Holmes, head on back. And then you're back in your body here on earth? And did this confirm your existing belief that there is in fact another world awaiting us after the inevitable death of our corporal forms?
First things first, Rebecca makes a quirky attempt to ridicule near-death experiences, but other than that, she seems to imply that in order to have a complex, vivid near-death experience, you need to have a preconceived belief in a god or in an afterlife. In order to demonstrate that this is wrong, we just need one example. Dr. Peter Cummings is a neuropathologist and he had one of these experiences. Dr. Cummings was a hardcore atheist who believed that the existence of God or an afterlife were just fantasies stemming from wishful thinking. However, he almost drowned in a rafting accident in Costa Rica in 2018, and he had a vivid, fairly typical blissful near-death experience, despite the fact that he had no beliefs in an afterlife or God before his experience. After his experience, he was convinced of the existence of the afterlife, and no, his experience did not include a meeting with Jesus giving him a high five.
Well, that was actually just your oxygen-starved brain desperately firing neurons and flooding your body with endorphins in an attempt to keep you alive.
Claim number 1, near-death experiences are caused by oxygen deprivation of the brain, also known as hypoxia. This theory is not new. One of the first proponents of this theory was British psychologist Susan Blackmore. It was brought back to relevance by Dutch anesthesiologist Gerald Verley a few years later. And then it was once again brought back to relevance a few years later by one of Rebecca's colleagues, the neurologist Steven Novella, who peddled this theory for many, many years, including on his neurological blog. At first, this theory may sound appealing because no matter how close you come to death, lack of oxygen to the brain is a common final pathway to brain death. However, Dr. Bruce Grayson, a professor of psychiatry and neurobehavioral sciences at the University of Virginia, has already examined this claim and concludes that it lacks empirical support. Dr. Grayson points out that people have near-death experiences without suffering from hypoxia or anoxia. He also points out that the phenomenological features of hallucinations resulting from hypoxia or anoxia are very different from typical near-death experiences. For example, hypoxia or anoxia usually leads to hallucinations which are frightening, have bizarre imagery, and which lead to a person to be belligerent. These features are not found in typical near-death experiences. Finally, Dr. Grayson points out that in various studies, people who have near-death experiences have normal or higher oxygen levels than those who did not report near-death experiences. Claim number 2, near-death experiences are somehow caused by random firing of neurons. This theory peddled here by Rebecca would have some merit if it wasn't for the fact that the people who have these near-death experiences have them during cardiac arrest. This physiological condition is so extreme that there is no such thing as random firing of neurons. When the heart stops, blood stops flowing to the brain, which causes the brain to shut down entirely. Decades of clinical research using electroencephalography have shown that during cardiac arrest, there is no electrical activity in the brain, therefore no random firing of neurons, as Rebecca claims.
Claim number 3, near-death experiences are somehow caused by a rush of endorphins to the brain at the point of death. This one kind of brings us back to the last point we made and raises the following question. How could any neurotransmitter or hormone, such as endorphins, act upon a brain which is completely inactive due to the extreme physiological condition it's going through, as is the case with patients who undergo cardiac arrest? Moreover, the model proposed by Rebecca is a highly speculative one which lacks empirical support. Of course, it's impossible to rule out this model entirely, but the real question is, do we have any good reason to entertain this model? Based on what I just mentioned, I would say no.
And sadly, there is no heaven or hell, and when we die, we're all just going to rot in the ground. Okay, just kidding. I don't know any of that. No one knows. But I have essentially just covered both sides of the near-death experience debate. You can honestly just skip the rest of this video if you want. There's no other real scientific evidence to suggest that a near-death experience, or NDE, is anything other than your desperate brain trying to keep you alive. On the one side, we have people who have had a life-changing psychedelic trip. And on the other side, we have scientists who point out that there is no evidence that anything was happening outside of their own brain. But I know that won't convince all of you, so I'm just going to keep talking for a little while. I'm thinking about all this right now thanks to an article I just read from Business Insider, which basically just describes a panel that the journalists saw at South by Southwest in which two scientists described their work on NDEs. If you're watching this on YouTube instead of reading the transcript, just know that there were a lot of quotation marks in that previous sentence. The scientists in question are Jim Tucker and Jennifer Kim Penberthy, two psychologists at University of Virginia, UVA.
Yes, Rebecca, they are scientists. And they are scientists with tremendous academic qualifications that do research in their respective fields and have gotten their papers published in reputable, peer-reviewed journals. You are a blogger who's advocated for the biggest ideologues of materialism, such as Steven Novella, but you're not a scientist. I'm not saying that your opinion is less valid just because you're not a scientist. I'm not a scientist either, but scientists don't stop being scientists just because they disagree with your preconceived beliefs.
Who study near-death experiences from the assumption that they are describing instances where a person's soul leaves their body. And so they look at these, and they also look at anecdotal reports of children who say that they are reincarnated beings. This sort of paranormal research is nothing new. People who believe in the existence of the soul and an afterlife for that soul have for centuries attempted to find empirical evidence for their beliefs. And after all of those centuries, they have literally nothing to show for it besides spooky stories. While other fields of real science have accelerated their rates of discoveries in the past few decades, parapsychologists like Tucker and Penberthy are really just sitting here in the year of our Lord 2022, repeating the exact same things that their forerunners have been saying for a century.
A quick look at the page of the Society for Psychical Research Sci Encyclopedia, which contains a vast amount of articles describing all the parapsychological experiments over the years, is enough to disprove what Rebecca just said here. And unlike Rebecca, the authors of all of these articles are actually objective in their analysis.
In fact, the reason why these people are paid to recycle elderly talking points is because the guy who invented the Xerox was a spiritualist and Zen Buddhist who believed in reincarnation. And in 1968, when he kicked it from a heart attack and left $1 million to UVA, he set the condition that they set up a department specifically to study the possibility of life after death, to be led by one Ian Stevenson. Stevenson was a true skeptic's quack. You know, back in the days when we expected more from our quacks. You know, he wasn't just a raving lunatic. He took his lunacy seriously.
Everyone who I don't agree with is a quack or a lunatic. Congratulations to Rebecca Watson for creating the strongest argument against scientific inquiry.
Traveling the world and exhaustively collecting stories from toddlers who claimed that they were different people in a previous life, comparing their stories to records of recently deceased people to solve the case of who these children were previously, and then writing it up in a scientific manner. Stevenson did come up with some great stories, like the one about a boy in Beirut who spoke of being a 25-year-old mechanic thrown to his death from a speeding car on a beach road. According to multiple witnesses, the boy provided the name of the driver, the exact location of the crash, the names of the mechanic's sisters and parents and cousins, and the people he hunted with, all of which turned out to match the life of a man who had died several years before the boy was born and who had no apparent connection to the boy's family. Wow, creepy, right? Only there's some problems. Stevenson didn't speak the languages of the people that he was interviewing, so he relied often on translators. They were usually in cultures where reincarnation was accepted more or less as fact. So even if the people involved weren't knowingly lying, there's a very good chance that they were misremembering things, putting words in the mouths of toddlers, and making the stories sound more impressive than they were.
This criticism by Rebecca is not new either. In fact, it was one of the more common types of criticism that Stevenson received back in the day. This criticism is weakened because of the fact that Stevenson chose reputable, scientific-minded academic colleagues as his interpreters. So the idea that somehow the interpreters were lying, misremembering, or putting words in the kid's mouth just to validate their reincarnationist beliefs is highly unlikely, not a very good chance.
And of course, then there were the people who did knowingly lie, like one translator who even Stevenson admitted had been very dishonest with him, but he still claimed that the stories he gathered through that translator could be trusted. A thing that his publisher at the time disagreed with, and they backed out of publishing his book because of it.
I couldn't find many sources backing what Rebecca said here. The only thing I found was a published paper by James Matlock, an anthropologist who researches reincarnation, who after analyzing published literature on reincarnation found out that one of the researchers was caught by his colleagues tampering with experimental data. And Dr. Matlock says that the works from this person have to be considered unreliable. The truth is that this person, who was caught tampering with data, conducted his own investigations independently, outside of Stevenson's own research efforts. I could find no evidence that Stevenson still believed that the cases from this particular person could be trusted, and this seems rather unlikely considering Stevenson often re-examined cases published by other researchers to find any weaknesses and/or missing pieces of information. Other than that, based on what I mentioned in our last point, I don't think it's very likely that even a part of Stevenson's interpreters were lying. It's also very interesting that Dr. Matlock, being a person who favors the reincarnation hypothesis and who has praised Stevenson's work, is more skeptical of his own position than Rebecca is, and is more than willing to call out people who give a bad name to his field of research.
There isn't a single story Stevenson gathered that can't be better explained as some mix of coincidence, exaggeration, and/or outright fraud on the part of the subjects or the translators, if not Stevenson himself.
Yeah, well, based on the things that we just mentioned, I think that the very case that you showed a few seconds ago is enough to completely disprove what you just said.
But there are plenty of really uncomfortable, ableist, and homophobic consequences of Stevenson's beliefs. For instance, if a little girl told a story about how she used to be a boy and now she refuses to wear traditionally girly clothes and only answers to the name Richard, Stevenson assumed that that's because that little girl used to be a man in a previous life named Richard. If a child had a disfigured face, he assumed that that was because in a previous life he was a man who had shot himself in the face. According to Stevenson, any disease, disorder, or quirk of personality could be explained by a violent end in a past life. That's really gross. Really gross. Like, imagine hand-waving away serious birth defects as the inevitable result of a past life, and not a disorder based on genetics or environment that we can prevent or alleviate. Imagine a kid rejecting the gender they were assigned at birth and using past life hypnosis or something to fix it. Gross.
Okay, so first of all, what? Homophobic? Look, Jesse Bering is a psychologist and a well-known skeptic who is openly homosexual and is also an LGBT rights activist. He has praised Stevenson's work, and he would most definitely disagree with your claim that Stevenson's conclusions are somehow homophobic. But let's assume, for the sake of discussion, that Stevenson's conclusions somehow have homophobic connotations to them. How does this in any way affect the veracity of Stevenson's research efforts and his evidence? It's like saying that we should dismiss all the scientific advances we have gotten from experimenting on animals because it's unethical. It's an appeal to emotion. It is also completely misleading to claim that Stevenson believed that only past lives are able to explain personality in children. Stevenson, contrary to what Rebecca claims here, clearly accepted that environment and genetics play a role in development of human personality. And again, contrary to what Rebecca claims, Stevenson merely regarded past lives as a possible third factor in some cases. But the so-called skeptics are so invested in painting their ideological opponents as lunatics that they completely exaggerate and misrepresent their positions to dismiss them, as Rebecca did here.
So now we come to Stevenson's proteges, Tucker and Penbarthy, who are doing the exact same thing in their research, uncritically accepting stories of children who claim to be reincarnated from past lives. They also talk about near-death experiences as further proof of an afterlife. And again, there's just nothing new under the sun. People say they floated above their bodies in an operating room and heard every conversation the doctors and nurses had. There are some frequently experienced details across these NDEs, like the old light at the end of the tunnel. They all like to talk to their dead relatives. All of this is taken as confirmation that NDEs are really the soul leaving the body. And all of it is old news. It's all been previously explained using non-paranormal explanations. Like, studies show that people who float above their bodies and see everything that is happening are unable to identify a playing card left in plain sight or an image on a computer that's displayed in the room.
What Rebecca conveniently forgets to mention is that in absolutely none of these studies, the people who had near-death out-of-body experiences had them in rooms which were fitted with the cards that she's talking about. So obviously, they could not be seen by the experiencer. Moreover, it's false that patients who had these out-of-body experiences are unable to identify targets. Dr. Charles Stark conducted a laboratory experiment of this kind in the 1960s with an acquaintance of his who constantly had out-of-body experiences during sleep, and the patient was able to correctly describe the number placed out of her sight.
She successfully told me that the number was 25132. Now, the odds of guessing a 5-digit number like that in one try are enormous. So I was quite excited, to put it mildly.
People on anesthesia who are in no way near death report similar things like being able to hear what is being said in the room while under anesthesia.
Yes, it is true that patients under anesthesia are not near death, but the point is that their brains are not functioning and thus not expected to be able to generate any experiences. Again, decades of clinical research using electroencephalography have shown that anesthesia strongly suppresses brain activity. The brain should not be able to generate any experience. Unbeknownst to Rebecca, she shoots herself in the foot here with this affirmation because she accidentally admits that people can have these mystical experiences while they're in anesthesia when their brains are shut down.
Scientists can recreate a near-death experience in random people by using hallucinogens like ketamine or even by throwing people into a centrifuge.
Rebecca here returns to the explanatory models for near-death experiences, so let's continue examining these claims made by her. Claim number 4, near-death experiences are caused by ketamine or other drugs. While it is true that there are similarities between certain accounts of ketamine trips and accounts of near-death experiences, they lack certain key features unique to near-death experiences. This theory about ketamine also suffers from a problem that we already discussed on a previous point. It is a highly speculative model without any empirical support.
There are also theories that brain chemicals produced under stress are causing NDEs, and people often report or relate this to endorphins, the feel-good hormones that are produced under stress, or ketamine-like drugs or DMT-like drugs. Now, many of these drugs they attribute this NDE to are not really known to exist in the brain. They're just hypothesized. But even those that we know exist, like the endorphins, are usually released in such tiny amounts for such a short period of time in some part of the brain we haven't identified that it would be virtually impossible to test these theories by what we know now.
Not only that, but this neurochemical model proposed by Rebecca suffers from another problem that we've already discussed in a previous point. How can neurotransmitters work in a brain which is completely shut down? Whether it's by anesthesia or by cardiac arrest, the fact is that the brain is not in any condition to support conscious experience, and that on its own puts the theory about neurochemicals to sleep. Claim number 5: near death experiences are caused by G-lock and centrifuges. The first proponent of this theory was U.S. Air Force surgeon James Winery, who in 1997 published a paper on the Journal of Near Death Studies reporting how healthy fighter pilots who were exposed to acceleration induced loss of consciousness, also known as G-lock, reported hallucinations that resembled near death experiences phenomenologically. They reported sensations of leaving the body, seeing lights, among the few other features similar to NDEs. There are several problems with this theory, however. Dr. Winery himself cautions that his findings do not explain all near death phenomena, and that rather could be used to differentiate episodes that occur during unconsciousness to those that are unique to NDEs. Most of the physical and mental symptoms of acceleration induced loss of consciousness are not found in NDEs, and most of the features of NDEs are not found in acceleration induced loss of consciousness. This theory is further weakened by the fact that there have been pilots who've experienced hallucinations related with acceleration induced loss of consciousness and later in life had NDEs. These pilots are able to differentiate between their G-lock hallucinations and their near death experiences. In short, while there are similarities between NDEs and hallucinations produced by G-lock, it makes little sense to assume they are the same type of phenomena. The rest of the video is just Rebecca repeatedly stating that there's just no evidence for any of this. But she also comes up with something that is interesting to see among the organized skeptic movement, and that is to claim that she wishes that all of this was true. I'm sure you do, but that there's just no evidence. Also, she claims, well, the evidence is there for anyone to look at and decide for themselves. She then goes on to claim that she finds it frustrating that the University of Virginia is still investing money into this field of research, which she pejoratively and colorfully dismisses as, quote, quackery. Has it perhaps occurred to Rebecca that the reason why the University of Virginia still lends support to this field of research is because it's a completely legitimate line of scientific inquiry into a topic that is not yet well understood? As a final point, Rebecca claims that people who investigate this phenomena and think that there's something to it are merely recycling old talking points that have been debunked years ago. Which, they haven't. Yet it is interesting that in the video she made, which she posted on 2022, she recycles outdated arguments and explanations that have been dealt with years or even decades ago by people who have actually delved deep into the research being done into these topics. I've given you my reasons as to why I think that Rebecca's arguments are flawed, and reasons why I think the phenomenon discussed is genuine. Ultimately, I suppose it is up to you to decide whether my arguments are suggestive or compelling to you. If there's something certain here, is that a growing number of scientists are starting to pay attention to these kinds of phenomena, and are slowly but surely moving away from the views and arguments that Rebecca and her gurus are trying to defend.